The Black Death. Sounds scary? It is. It's a bit like the coronavirus or COVID-19. Stay tuned and I'll tell you more. The Black Death. It sounds scary. Well, it was. It was a pandemic that went through the known world from about 1347 to 1348, and it gradually died out in the 1350s. Oh, and don't forget, if you like this episode, click the like button, please. And if it's your first time, subscribe and click the bell so you'll be notified when I release another video. Now, the symptoms for the Black Death, it was virtually people would have these lumps growing in their lymph nodes, which is under the arms or in their groin. And they would grow to the size of an egg or even an apple if they were very unfortunate. And they were called buboes, which is a form of the bubonic plague. And the Black Death is a bit like the bubonic plague, but I'll get to that shortly. Now, the symptoms for the Black Death, which was very similar to the bubonic plague, people would have a fever. They would develop these swellings in their lymph nodes under the arms or in their groin. They would have black spots forming on their bodies. And also they would have coughs and they'd be coughing up blood. And then they would get gangrene. And that's when their toes and their fingers and their nose and their lips would turn black because those parts of the body was being starved of oxygen and that parts of the body was actually dying. And then the person would probably succumb to being in a coma and then dying. Not very nice. And this actually happened to most of the population. It was something that very few escaped. And it was something that ravaged right through Europe. Now, originally, it started in China, and then it moved to the Middle East, and then came across to Sicily on the boats from Genoa. Now, when the boats docked in Sicily, they saw the sick occupants, and they told the boat that they had to leave, and so the boats left. But it was too late because the disease had came to shore and spread from Sicily into the rest of Europe. Now, it was originally spread by rats, or so they think. Now, I'll get to this. It's spread by the bite from the fleas that are on the rats. They bite someone and they can spread it to someone else by biting them. And that's how the bubonic plague is spread across. Now, there's different theories with the Black Death in that the sense that it actually wasn't the bubonic plague, or it was actually a form of the bubonic plague. And research has shown, in fact, there's a book by Susan Scott and Christopher Duncan in Biology of Plagues that actually say that in their research that the Black Death wasn't the bubonic plague. It was a slightly different disease, but very similar. They've studied the trails of the Black Death, and they've noticed that it actually spread a lot quicker than any of the bubonic plagues. And it spread to places where there were no rats. So it's been decided that it was actually spread by humans traveling and merchants that were traveling. And no one could pick up on this because the incubation period, which is the time when someone gets affected and then showing signs that they've got the disease, for the bubonic plague, it's approximately 20 to 30 days. But with the Black Death, it's around 37, so a lot longer, and they can spread the disease a lot more before they realize they were carrying the disease. Now, when this was found out, cities started implementing quarantine. Sounds familiar. Now, originally, quarantine started in the city of Ragusa, which is now modern-day Dubrovnik in Croatia. They were the first city to actually implement quarantine, then followed by Milan and Venice. In fact, Venice actually would stop the ships coming in, and they would have them being quarantined on an island just outside of Venice till they were cleared of the quarantine date. And it actually comes from the Italian variant of quarantagioni, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, which actually means 40 days. And originally it started with 30 days, stretching the quarantine to 40 days. And then it was adopted by cities like Milan and Venice. And people actually had to have health ID cards to say they were coming from, basically saying where they were coming from, whether they were coming from a clean city or a city that was infected. And back in those days, a lot of cities, well, most cities, were surrounded by walls. And you could only get into the cities through the city gates. And a lot of merchants supplying goods to the cities would actually have to leave their goods outside the city gates. And guards would come in and collect the goods and leave the payment for the merchants outside the gates, just so the disease wouldn't come in with the people into the city and infect the whole place. And that's how a lot of disease was actually stopped by quarantine. And back in the day, they didn't know about germ theory. And so they didn't really know what caused this. Their medical knowledge was quite limited. And so it was the wrath of God. It was punishment for their sin. That's why this pestilence had fallen upon them. Now, to appease God, a lot of them would repent, naturally. Some of them would punish themselves, like hitting themselves, flagellating themselves, like whipping themselves on the back with a whip, just to appease God so they would be saved. In fact, some of them even ran to the churches and stayed in the churches for protection because they thought this was punishment for God. Some people would actually run away from their families if some of them had contracted the sickness. They would leave their spouses, they would leave their children behind just to get away from the disease. In fact, in some cities, they were known to actually have walled up the whole house. But the occupants in the house, whether some of them had contracted the disease yet or not from the other family members, they were walled up as well. And so naturally they would have contracted it and died as well. It was very scary times and enough to sound pandemonium. In fact, the Jews were actually accused of poisoning the waters, and that's why people were coming down with the Black Death. And some of them Jews were actually driven away from the towns and the cities. But the Black Death didn't actually go to some northern parts, like Poland. Now, some of the Jews actually went to Poland. It was under the reign of King Casimir the Great, and I hope I pronounced his name correctly as well. Now the Jewish population were very hygienic, and they actually had a very clean way of living, which is actually a bit different from the way the rest of society was at the time. And so they fled to Poland, which King Casimir the Great welcomed them. Well, the territory of Poland at the time was one of the few places which actually missed the Black Death. And there was no cure for the Black Death. Medieval doctors at that time would actually protect themselves, and that looked a bit scary in itself. What they would do would actually cover their whole selves up in a cloak, and they'd wear gloves and a wide brim hat. And on their face would be a mask to protect themselves, which actually looked like a bird with a beak. Now, in the beak, they would have strong smelling substances there, like dried roses, carnations, herbs, spices, camphor, even a vinegar sponge. And basically, that was to clean the air that they were breathing in through the beak, which was supposedly to protect them from catching the disease. It's a bit very similar to our modern day protective clothing in a way. And that's how they would visit people and treat people. And the best protection was quarantine. In fact, there's an English town a few centuries later, when the Great Plague was coming around, in 1665, the town of Im in Derbyshire in the UK, and I hope I pronounced that town correctly. They were infected with the plague. Apparently a traveler had arrived with laundry that was infected, and it spread through the town. Now, on the advice of Rector William Mompesson, he advised that no one was to leave or enter the town, just to contain the infection so it wouldn't spread to the neighboring areas. And 80% of the population perished, including his own wife. And to this very day, every year on the last Sunday in August, they have a commemorative service remembering the bravery of that town. All sounds very similar with the coronavirus, COVID-19, with quarantine. It's the only way, it seems, to curb the infection. It's a virus, so unfortunately there's no cure for viruses. Bacteria there is, but not for viruses. And with the common cold, which is the flu, which people get, which is caused by a virus, it usually doctors will tell you it has to run its course. So take the precaution and stay home if you can, and stop the spread, because there's the incubation period where people pass on the disease without actually knowing about it. And that's why we're staying home and self-isolating ourselves. So do the right thing, stay at home. So the Black Death, punishment from God. Is the coronavirus punishment from God? Depends on who you talk to. So please stay home and quarantine and put an end to the coronavirus, COVID-19. So until next time, don't forget, if you've liked this episode, click the like button. And if it's your first time here or you haven't subscribed just yet, subscribe please, and click the bell so you'll be notified when I release another video. And I'll be doing videos on strange topics, paranormal, spirituality. Stay safe, stay well, stay happy, and join me, and I'll see you soon.